The world is intrigued by fossils. Of course, many think that that evidence belongs to the evolutionist. This is their evidence. Many Christians are somewhat intimidated by the evidence from the fossil record. That ought not to be the case. I think when you look at this lecture and we consider the evidence from the fossil record, you'll see strong confirmation of the creation model, that the evidence fits much better within that model than the evolution model. But how will we establish the nature of the evidence? If, of course, I've received training in this area, but if I say this, some would think, well, you're prejudiced in your analysis of the fossil record. And so we'll allow the evolutionist himself to describe the nature of that record. This is using the technique of the antagonistic witness. If you're in court and a friend testifies on your behalf, that'll help, but not nearly as much as when you get the enemy to acknowledge your point. That's worth 10 times as much judicially. And so we'll be looking at the evidence as described by the evolutionists themselves. Let's begin with a statement by S.M. Stanley of Johns Hopkins University. Emphasizing the significance of this evidence, he says it's doubtful whether, in the absence of fossils, the idea of evolution would represent anything more than an outrageous hypothesis. I hope you will remember that statement. Without the fossils, if you don't have fossils testifying to evolution, then it's just, evolution is just an outrageous hypothesis. The fossil record, he says, and only the fossil record provides direct evidence of major sequential changes in the Earth's biota. If you have evidence for evolution, this is where it's at, if you please. However, we're looking at historical evidence. Notice the implications of that as emphasized by John Horner, actually usually referred to as Jack, a very famous dinosaur digger-upper, paleontologist. If you saw Jurassic Park, this film was based on his, or the character in the film was based on him. He was the actual paleontologist digging up dinosaurs up in Montana. But he wrote the book Dinosaur Lives and said paleontology is a historical science. A science based on circumstantial evidence after the fact. And so he says we can never reach hard and fast conclusions. That's the way history works. That's what paleontology is. He continues, these days it's easy to go through school for a good many years and sometimes even through college without ever hearing that some sciences are historical or by nature inconclusive. Yes, a great many people will say, no, the fossil record proves this. Well, the fossil record by its very nature is historical and does not do that. It gives indications, but we want to see what the indications are from this historical science of paleontology. And we ought to be able to look at the fossil record and tell whether the evidence supports the creation or the evolution model, because the predictions of both are absolutely different. If we think about it for a moment, we would see that the beginning of the fossil record, which would show the greatest contrast, would predict that with the evolutionist there would be gradual, simple beginnings that are linked progressively upward, whereas the creationist would predict a complex and abrupt and diverse beginning right from the start. Now, of course, we believe we're looking at a flood deposit, and so we wouldn't find all animals that lived on the ground there at the bottom of the ocean. They'd be mostly ocean-dwelling organisms, but they would not be simple. They would be complex, and there would be many kinds right to start with. We should be able to tell a very obvious difference in this critical area, the beginning of the fossil record. And as we continue studying the fossil record, we see that the evolutionist would predict similarities that would be branching, that is connected. You would see allied continuum. You would see progression. This is what would characterize the fossil record, whereas the creationist says, no, there would be similarities. It's reasonable to assume that a creator would create similar forms for similar functions, but they would not be in this branching pattern, but more of a mosaic pattern, like where the artist would use a blue tile here and a blue tile there, wherever he needed it, not necessarily connected. There would be separate and distinct, and stasis, that is, staying the same, is the principle that would characterize the fossil record. Again, beginning and continuing, there's a contrast. We ought to be able to look at the record and see which is served best by the facts of the fossil record. National Geographic had this introduction to the Cambrian period a few months ago, describing an explosion of life. The Cambrian is the lowest part of that geologic column. This is where you first find complex life. Before it, you have some blue-green algae and some bacteria that I think lived in the ground before the flood deposit began. But when it really begins, it just explodes on the scene. In The Blind Watchmaker, Richard Dawkins describes the condition of the beginning of the fossil record. We find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. Now, it is evolution that he's seeing here. This is the way he sees it. But the very first time they appear, they're advanced. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Now, he has great faith that there was an evolutionary history, but it's not there in evidence. He believes this is a state of evolution, but that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at a sudden appearance, as if they were just planted. Needless to say, he goes on to point out, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted the creationist. I'll plead guilty to that. Yes, it's delightful. Not necessarily that we're trying to force the evidence, but this is encouraging if you take this position. And I think we need to just follow the facts wherever they lead. But one who believes this is the best explanation from the evidence is certainly delighted as he sees this kind of support. An example of the kind of thing he's talking about, the complex fossils from the beginning, can be seen in the trilobites, which are perhaps the most common fossil in the lowest part of the Cambrian. These are the little roly-poly type critters that lived at the bottom of the ocean, but they were very complex creatures, though bottom-dwelling creatures. Science News reported just a few years ago regarding their eyes that they may have been superior to current living animals. They had, in principle, perfect vision, we're told. They possessed the most sophisticated eye lenses ever produced by nature. And some of them are so well preserved that you can still take photographs through the lenses of these very sophisticated eyes. They continue saying they look like they were designed by a physicist. Well, I think they were designed, that's what it looks like, but that's certainly not the kind of beginning of the fossil record that would be predicted by the evolutionist. The slow, gradual progression is what's predicted, the simple beginning, but no, that's not what we see. Ocean bottom-dwelling creatures that were very complex and, as we'll see, very diverse. In fact, Stephen Gould of Harvard says the Cambrian explosion occurred in a geological moment, and we have reason to think all major anatomical designs made their evolutionary appearance at that time. Now, it was evolutionary, but you've got all of the major phyla, he says, there at the beginning. In fact, we have more there than we have now. We've lost some of them, but all of the ones we have now, we had right at the beginning. Now, this is not the way it's supposed to work for the evolutionist. All of the major, and he uses that word designs, which of course he doesn't believe, but that's what it looks like, and so we catch him using it from time to time. He continues saying not only the phylum Chordata itself, and of course that's our phylum, the animals with backbones, not only the most sophisticated, we like to think, animals with back, but all its major divisions. Not just seeing that highest order, but all the major divisions of that highest order, right at the Cambrian explosion, right at the beginning. Now, if a creationist were trying to write the story themselves, they could hardly do a better job. He continues, adding another significant point here in a lecture recorded at SMU University. Since the so-called Cambrian explosion, no new phyla of animals have entered the fossil record. So at the beginning, you've got more than you have today. It's dwindled down. But all that you have today are there, and there have been no new ones since. When it starts, you got it all, and it's been going downhill since then, is really basically what he's saying. Now, that is not what the evolutionist would predict. We can summarize this way from quotes from the evolutionist. We won't take time to document all of these in this presentation, but we have these in handouts. They were complex, as Dawkins says. They appeared suddenly right at the start, as if they were just planted there in advanced form without an evolutionary history. We find land plants. Now, many of the earth science textbooks will tell us that during the Cambrian there's nothing but shallow seas everywhere. Well, if you've got 60 genera of land plants, that's obviously not the case. In fact, there are 6 groups of vascular plants described as advanced in the literature. Vascular plants are like trees, the woody types. Obviously, there has to be land somewhere. This is what we find in this lowest part. All the major anatomical designs, as Gould says, the chordata, the highest order, all of its major divisions. We have vertebrates now, which many thought didn't belong and wouldn't be in this lowest order, lowest layer, from Wyoming, from Oklahoma, from Washington, Nevada, Idaho, Arkansas. We have them from, in fact, this is documented from 1978, though you still don't see that acknowledged in many of the geology textbooks. And then Gould says, since this beginning of this, in this lowest part of the lowest layer, you have no new phyla. They're all there to start with. Now, just be honest about this. What does this look like? Which model is served best? Is that a difficult question? In the critical part, the beginning of the geologic record, which would be most distinctive, that is to distinguish the creation model from the evolution, you look and you see very different from the evolutionist, just exactly what the creationist would predict. Just as almost as if we had written the story, and yet these acknowledgments are from the leading authorities in evolution. Not only do we see this sudden, complex, diverse beginning right from the start, as you continue upward, you see that there are separate and distinct kinds throughout the record, not this progressive continuum. Quoting here from Discover magazine of a few years ago, they're describing this lowest part and then the continuing fossil record. This demonstrates, we're told, that large animal phyla of today were present already in the early Cambrian, and that they were as distinct from each other as today. Now, they're not just gradually leading one from one to the other. They're just as distinct as you see today. A menagerie of clam cousins, sponges, segmented worms, other invertebrates that would seem vaguely familiar to any scuba diver. Now, mostly invertebrates at the bottom of the ocean, which I think is the environment we're looking at. But we do have vertebrates there. But they're the kind of things that any scuba diver would recognize, and they're separate and distinct right from the start, just as they are today. Where's this progressive continuum that that the evolutionist would be looking for? We read from Valentine and Irwin, 2 of the leading evolutionary biologists in the world, writing in their textbook Development. If we were to expect to find ancestors to or intermediates between higher taxa, it would be in the rocks of the late Precambrian or Ordovician time. These are the earliest Precambrian, Cambrian, Ordovician, the earliest. That's where you'd expect to find the ancestors of the higher taxa. But that's when the bulk of the world's higher animal taxa evolved, he believes, right there at the start. Yet traditional alliances are unknown or unconfirmed for any of the phyla or classes appearing in them. Now, Gould acknowledged they were all right in the Cambrian explosion, the lowest part of the Cambrian. He widens all the way up to and including the Ordovician, but even including that, you find no connecting branches. You find unknown intermediates for any of the phyla or classes. They're not connected. They're separate and distinct And this is their acknowledgement. Yet when you look in the biology textbook, what do you see? You see the tree of life and they're all connected. Well, they're not connected in the fossil record. They're distinct and separate. The lines are drawn by the evolutionist and arranged in this pattern because that's the theory. That's not what the fossil record tells us. In fact, Stephen Gould says the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossils. So when you see these connected branches, these trees of life, understand, even the leading evolutionists acknowledge, this is not what the fossil record says. This is very different. They have connected it in the textbook. But what causes them to connect it in this manner? What allows them to arrange it this way? Well, not the fossils. What did do it? Before we get to that point, notice Gould acknowledging that what you really find in the beginning is this broad, diverse picture, very much like the top of the tree. If you turn it upside down, it would be closer. He says the sweep of anatomical diversity reached a maximum right after the initial diversification. Right at the beginning, you've got more diverse kinds than later. He says the later history of life proceeded by elimination, not expansion. It started broad, it went downhill. That is, more phyla were eliminated as you proceeded. But how do you get this tree? Well, Dr. Patton, in their book Evolution of the Earth, acknowledged this. We have arranged the groups in a traditional way, with the simplest forms first and progressively more forms, complex forms following. This particular arrangement is arbitrary and depends on what definition of complexity you wish to choose. So they just arranged it that way because, of course, they have great faith in the evolutionary theory. But to be completely fair to them, that when they say it's arbitrary, they don't mean that there's no basis of it. They do have a basis, but that basis is different with different authorities. In that sense, the different authorities arbitrarily say it went our way. But the basic principle that guides it, he goes on to say, is because things are alike, or involves the idea that things are alike because they're related. The less they look alike, the further removed they are from their common ancestor. That's how they build the tree. Things get put close together because they look alike, and then by that means of comparing similarities, you build this progressive continuum in spite of the distinct separate kinds that you see in the fossil record. Well, we look at the fossil record and we see similarities, don't we? They're absolutely undeniable. And when you talk about fossils, you just have to talk about similarities if you're going to make any sense out of it, certainly in terms of evolution. Otherwise, you just have billions of dead things in rocks. So you line them up by looking at similarities. We look at the ape and the man. Can anyone deny the similarity? I don't think any honest person could. The question is, why are they similar? Now, the fact that you can see one possibility doesn't mean there are not others and other better explanations. When we drive down the subdivision, we see houses that are similar, for example, and that's not because they're cousins. We see common genetics is not a very good explanation here. Obviously, common designer explains better. And when we look at the living world, we see designs, I believe, as Gould had indicated inadvertently, and that would indicate a common designer that at least explains similarities as well. But I think when we look more closely at the similarities in the real world, we see a distinct advantage with one of these explanations. These similarities of the hand of the mammal, so to speak, are supposed to be as a result of genetics, inheriting common genes. But what we have found from genetics is this is not the case. Sir Gavin de Beer is one of the leading authorities in that field. And here in the Oxford Biology Reader, he says it's now clear that the pride with which it was assumed that the inheritance of homologous structures from a common ancestor explain homology was misplaced. Homology involves this concept of similarities that indicate evolution inherited from common genes. In fact, that's the way Darwin defined it. That's what homology is, similarities that come from common genes. Well, we thought the common genetics explained this. He says that pride was misplaced. He continues saying, for such inheritance cannot be ascribed to identity of gene. When we look at that diagram of the hands, we see, studying embryology, that these similar structures come from different parts of the embryo. We see, for example, in the newt, they come from segments 2 through 5. From the salamander, it comes from segments 6 through 9. And in man, it comes from segments 13 through 18. Totally different genetics producing these hand-like structures. And so De Beer says, no, there's no such thing as homologous genes. He continues saying the attempt to find homologous genes has been given up as hopeless. But if that similarity is not genetic and doesn't come from common genes, then we've got to look for another explanation. I think we have one. The evolutionary explanation begins to fade in this comparison. It's similar to the argument that we see in most of the textbooks today that began over 100 years ago with Haeckel, who drew similarities of embryos. And in the upper portion of this picture, we see a variety of organisms, but obvious similarities in the earliest part of the embryonic stage. But as they develop, we see the fish and the salamander, the pig, the chicken, the man. They began to look more different. But they began very similar, and that proves this common origin, you see. And that argument was one of the most impressive, Darwin said, that he saw for his theory. And it's been in textbooks ever since then. Though we knew better, Keith Thompson, president of the Academy of Sciences, acknowledged this. The theory is sometimes called ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which, that's impressive sounding. What that means is you started out in one form of the embryo and you went through the lizard stage and the chicken stage and on up through other stages. And that kind of an argument is used by the abortionist to justify killing babies in the lizard stage, because obviously that's all right. Keith Thompson says, surely the biogenetic law, referring to this ontogeny, recapitulates phylogeny, surely it's dead as a doornail. This was back in '88. But he says it was finally exercised from biology textbooks in the 50s. Well, maybe in the ones he's familiar with. They're still in the textbooks in Texas and throughout the country. As a topic of serious theoretical inquiry, it was extinct in the 20s. And we knew it from the 20s. Taken out of the textbooks, he says, in the 50s, here in 1988, he says, why, nobody believes this anymore, but yes, they do. In fact, there was an expose done just a couple of years ago here in the front page, on the front page of the London Illustrated News. We see Haeckel's drawings on top, but at the bottom, we see the actual photographs of the embryos that are supposed to look very similar, which do not at all. In fact, the headlines is Haeckel was just an embryonic liar, and that is the case. Here, Research News and Science Magazine again shows similar pictures. The upper lineup here shows the actual picture. The lower lineup shows the supposed similarities as Haeckel drew it. Not at all like it was. And notice the headlines, Haeckel's embryos, fraud rediscovered. Well, they knew it back in the 20s. But now then it's been rediscovered. It's been published on the headlines, the front page of the newspapers. It's here in Science. It's also in New Scientist. Quoting here from New Scientist, although Haeckel confessed and was convicted of fraud at the University of Jena, the drawings persist. That's the real mystery, Richardson says. The drawings do persist. We look at the newest textbook in Texas. Our students, or actually the taxpayers, pay like $85 a copy for. Beautiful, elaborately illustrated textbook, and there are the drawings just like Haeckel drew them, the fraud, the disgusting misrepresentation of evidence that we've known for a long time, but there it is, big as life, right there still in the textbooks. And the argument is similarities would indicate common genetic relationship. Well, even that's not so. As we've seen, there is at least another possibility. Common genetic origin could explain similarities, but when we look at genetics, we see these similar parts come from different genetics. It could be explained by common designer, and so even if it were true, it doesn't prove the point, but it's not true. And being a fraud, it's still perpetrated on our school children. We see a similar argument that at least was made quite often in the past, and we still hear it from time to time today, involving numbers of chromosomes. With the headlines of all the information with the Human Genome Project, I've heard several references to how many chromosomes we have. And we look at this sequence and we see what looks like an evolutionary sequence. The human has 46, and look here, penicillium only has 2. And the possum's in the middle of about 22. That looks better. The alligator, 32. We can understand that. That looks like an evolutionary picture, but what you find, and this is true with all, many times when you're examining this evidence, that some of the evidence, when you only look at part of it, can be interpreted to support evolution. But when you back up and get the whole picture, it looks very, very different. We look back at this chart where more information is included, and yes, man has 46, but tobacco has 48. The chimp has 48. The fern has 480. Penicillium has 2. But look at the onion, has 32. The opossum has 22. This is not an evolutionary picture. It can be made to look like an evolutionary picture if you select the evidence and if you arrange the evidence and don't talk about the rest of it. I like to look at the whole picture. I like to see who's doing the arranging and what assumptions are involved in the arrangement. I like to see all of the evidence. When you see all of it, it looks very different. Similar arguments are made by comparing the DNA of chimps to humans, and it's often pointed out there's only 1.6% difference in the DNA. It's very, very similar, you see. And that we don't know for sure is true. We haven't completed the sequence of either chimp or human. But there's some indirect inferences that would lead us to that conclusion. That's not completely out of the question. But how much difference is 1.6% when we're talking about 3 billion nucleotides in the human genome? Well, 1.6% of 3 billion pieces of information is significant. How much difference can it make to have 1.6% difference? Well, let's think about it in terms, we're talking about 48 million nucleotides there, 1.6%. That's a lot of nucleotides. And comparing that to cystic fibrosis, we see the change that produces cystic fibrosis only involves a billionth of 1%. Not 1.6%, but 1 billionth of 1% of the genome, a difference of just 3, not 48 million. And when we consider sickle cell anemia, it's 1/3 of that. 1/3 of 1 billionth of 1% produces this phenomenon that is often fatal. We're talking about a difference of 1 nucleotide, and yet we're told that, it's only 1.6%, 48 million nucleotides. And, surely you can do that. Now you see it looks very different. We find lots of similarities. Sometimes we don't completely understand, because what we learn is that these bits of information often do several things at once in different directions, and it takes combinations in order to produce the effects. Just changing one doesn't necessarily affect only one thing. It may affect several things, and it takes quite a few to affect the complete feature, like an eye, for example. And then similarities like this are beginning to show up. Notice the statement here from last year, the sheepish ancestors. Sue Galloway, University of Ontario, who led the team, included scientists at Helsinki University in Finland, was quoted as saying, "Sheep are human, basically. 98% of our genes are the same." Well, and we have found that bacteria is about 90% the same. You have to not only have the same sequence, but you have to have combinations that are doing the same thing, that turn on and off at the same time and work together in the same way. And by that means you see that similarities don't mean nearly as much in this area as we're often told. We become more like sheep. But let's look carefully at similarities, and what we see is they're selecting just some, like the case with the chromosomes. We look at some similarities and we see, obviously, there's not an evolutionary relationship. If you think these fish look similar, then I've caught you, because neither one of them are fish. One's a mammal and one's a reptile. they're very, very different. The adage is that which proves too much proves nothing. Here we see the reptile and the fish and the mammal that look similar, that are not related at all, we're told. And when we look to the marsupial animals, we see anteaters, we see mice, we see moles, we see wolves, we see cats, but none of them are kin. Very different, totally different reproductive system. But I thought similarity was supposed to prove common genetic relationship. No, it does not, especially when we examine the genetics and when we see similarities that obviously do not. David Norman, Sedgwick Museum, University of Cambridge, says from very different stocks, the marsupial carnivores and placentia carnivores produce animals almost identical in physical form. The true wolf, the thylacine marsupial wolf, almost identical. We look at the saber-toothed tigers, one marsupial, one placentia. Not kin, but almost identical. The wolf skulls, you have to be a real expert to see the difference. Well, you see, similarities don't always prove the point. And then, if they did, then this creature, the platypus, would be kin to everybody, wouldn't he? He has fur like the beaver. He has fangs that inject venom like the reptile, lays eggs like a reptile, has feet like a duck, and a bill like a duck. In fact, when they were first discovered, they were written up in Nature magazine as a fraud. Somebody, they said, sewed a duck bill on a beaver, which is what it like. Well, he's kin to everybody. We see the fangs here, and we see the injecting venom like the reptiles, but he's not. And he's not a duck. And so that which proves too much proves nothing. Let's look at the overall picture of similarities. When we look at blood serum, we're often told the chimpanzee blood serum is very similar, and with the right anti-serum, actually you can use chimpanzee blood serum with humans, with some of them. When you can't use your own brother sometimes with a different blood type. That's very, very similar. And we look in the mirror, and I won't get personal, but some of you can see some real similarities there, and so it's not unexpected in the serum. But let's look at the whole picture and see if we're looking at a branching pattern or a mosaic pattern. When we look at milk chemistry, it's not the chimpanzee at all. It's the donkey that's our closest relative. When we look at cholesterol, which everybody seems to be concerned about today, it's the garter snake that has cholesterol just like we do. When we look at foot structure, which we're concerned about down at Glen Rose, what could have made this? Well, the closest relative seems to be a glacial bear. Of course, he's a quadruped with big claws. You can distinguish that, but you remove the claws, and wow, it looks very human. Certainly the skeletal structure. It's the reverse image. The thumbs are on the outside. You can tell the difference, but it's very, very similar, I think, due to common designer. The chicken has a very complex enzyme, lysosome, designed, I think, to fight bacteria in the egg. Well, we need that kind of thing in our eyes, and the tear ducts produce that to fight bacteria. Here's where the blue tile, if you please, was needed with the egg and with the eye. We need bacteria-fighting enzymes, and it's a very, very complex protein involved here. Not only a long lineup of amino acids, but folded geometrically in a very complex manner in order to function appropriately. When we look to blood antigen A, the butter bean has blood antigen A just like we do, and lo and behold, the cockroach has this very complex brain hormone just as we do. Notice this picture from Discovery magazine of just a few years ago. Under the picture it says, "Don't squash that roach, he may be your cousin." He says the cockroach and man, it seems, share a common brain hormone. Not similar, but a common brain hormone. We're looking at similarities, but they're not branching. They are of a mosaic pattern that would indicate a common designer. They are not from common genetics, from the same part of the embryo. They're different. They fit our view of the evidence. They don't fit the evolutionary view. When you're allowed to choose which things you want to show, not the whole picture, and then line them up the way you want to line them up, like they did with the chromosomes, you can prove just anything you want. This cartoon was published back in Darwin's day, pointing out that some might try to begin with a pig. Some fellows are kind of pig-headed. And you change that pig there on the left-hand side upward just a little bit at a time. Gradually, you can get it up to look like a bull. and then continue to change that bull on down around to the right, and you come up with a man. And so obviously man evolved from pigs by means of the bull. Isn't that scientific? That's what happens when you see people selectively picking out the evidence and eliminating evidence that doesn't fit and arranging it the way they want to. And when you look at the fossil evidence, you see people selecting in their lineups what they want, eliminating the whole picture, which I want you to see, and then arranging them the way they want to depict their picture. But when you look at the whole evidence, all of the evidence from similarities, you see a distinct advantage with the creation model, as we will see throughout our examination of the evidence as we compare the two models. We have seen that the critical evidence of the fossil record, certainly in the beginning, is in favor of the creation model when we see sudden, complex beginning without that progressive continuum the evolutionist would predict. When we look at the similarities which are supposed to guide these family trees, we see the similarities actually are selected similarities, ignoring many similarities, and that they are arranged according to arbitrary assumptions and actually can best be explained not by common genetics, but by common designer. But if we're to see change in the fossil, if we're to see evolution, if it's to be proved, how would you discern it from the fossil record? Well, you'd have to see these continuums, these changes from one kind to another kind. Is that what we see? Well, let's talk about that portion of it, and again allow the evolutionists themselves to describe the evidence. Notice the statement by Stephen Gould, who says, every paleontologist knows, in other words, this is not just a few willing to admit it, they all know most species don't change. That's bothersome. It brings distress. Now, as we saw from Dawkins earlier, the fossil record was delightful to the creationist in his analysis, but now then, in terms of trying to find change, it's distressful and it's bothersome to the evolutionist because you don't see the change in the fossil record. He says they may get a little bigger or bumpier, they may remain, but they remain the same species, and that's not due to imperfections and gaps, but stasis. Darwin said the imperfection of the fossil record, the fact we haven't collected enough, is why you have the gaps. But he says that's not the case. Now then, we have collected billions and billions of these things. The principle that we see is stasis. It stays the same. It doesn't change. Now, stasis is just about the opposite, almost precisely the opposite of evolution. And that's the principle that dominates the fossil record, according to perhaps the best known and leading evolutionist, anti-creationist in the country today. He continues to say, yet this remarkable stasis has generally been ignored as no data. If they don't change, it's not evolution, so you don't talk about it. Now, this is not a creationist, though it may sound like it, but the leading anti-creationist, evolutionist in the country. He said, I regard the failure to find a clear vector of progress. Now, how would you prove evolution? Well, you'd have to show some progress in the fossil record. The failure to find a clear vector of progress in life history is the most puzzling fact of the fossil record. Now, on the one hand, for the creationist, we see that which is delightful. It delights us. On the other hand, it's bothersome, it's troubling, it's puzzling. What's the problem? He says we have sought to impose a pattern that we hope to find on a world that does not really display it. This puzzles him. He's had a failure in the kind of evidence that you really need to prove evolution, and it's just not there. And that's not me saying that. That's the leading authority in the field saying that. Notice the statement from Natural History again. He says, we can tell tales of improvement for some groups, but in honest moments we must admit that the history of complex life is more a story of multifarious variation about a set of basic designs than a saga of accumulating excellence. Now, here we caught him with that word design again, which he doesn't believe in. You can tell tales, and they certainly do that well, with lots of imagination. But when you get down to the real evidence, you see things getting a little bigger, a little bumpier, varying about basic designs. And that's the principle of stasis that we see continually illustrated in the fossil record. Let's go back to Darwin's day and notice his view of the fossil record. Many people think Darwin was convinced by that evidence, but that's not what convinced him at all. In fact, that was a problem. Quoting from Origin of the Species, he says, "Innumerable transitional forms must have existed, but why do we not find them embedded in the countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Why is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links?" Now, he doesn't have good answers to that. He thinks, well, with further collecting, they will be filled, but that prediction has failed. He says, "Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. This is perhaps the greatest objection which can be urged against my theory." Now, Darwin wasn't convinced by the fossil record. The fossil record was the greatest objection that could be urged against his theory, which he himself acknowledged, though he predicted those gaps would be filled in. And some have pointed out, well, this is a quotation from over 100 years ago, and now then we've learned a lot more. And surely over the years it's gotten better. No, just the opposite is true. Notice the admission by David Rapp, who is curator of invertebrate paleontology from the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History, professor at Columbia of geology. He says Darwin was completely aware of this. He was embarrassed by the fossil record because it didn't look the way he predicted it would. And then he continues, well, we're now 120 years after Darwin. The knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hadn't changed much. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's day. He predicted it would get better. The prediction failed. It's gotten worse. And he specifically mentioned some of those things that Darwin thought did have links that really don't. They have dwindled in number over the years. Rapp continues, saying, by this I mean some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. Did you know that had been discarded? It had to be changed. Well, the evolution of the horse in North America is one of the classic examples that you see in all the textbooks, but here is the curator, one of the curators of the fossil museum in America that has more fossils than any other museum in the country, that says, no, you had to discard this. And leading authorities know this. We see this in the textbooks. Most would say the first one that's in most of the lineups really didn't lead to the horse anyway. They led to Eohippus, but of course it's just which similarities you look at and which authority arbitrarily says it went this way or that way. Basically, you got big horses and little horses. We see that today, and we see even some with extra toes on them still around today. Colin Patterson of the British Museum of Natural History, and this is the museum that has the most fossils in all of the world, and he's the senior paleontologist. He's being quoted here in Harper's Magazine. He said there have been an awful lot of stories, some more imaginative than others. The most famous example, still an exhibit downstairs, is the exhibit on horse evolution, prepared 50 years ago. Now, it's still there in the museum. But this is an example of the stories, the imaginative type stories that are being told. He says that this has been presented as the literal truth in textbook after textbook. He says, now, I think that is lamentable, particularly when the people who propose those kinds of stories may themselves be aware of the speculative nature of some of that stuff. It's still in the textbooks. It's speculative. It's a lamentable story, according to perhaps the leading authority in the world, certainly one of the leading authorities in the world. But like what we saw a moment ago with Haeckel's drawings, it's just very hard to get out of the textbooks. George Gaylord Simpson is perhaps the leading authority, or was recently deceased, from Harvard on the subject of horse evolution. He wrote the book. He is the most prominent authority in the field. He says the uniform continuous transformation of Hydrotherium into equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers. That's exactly what you see represented in the fossil horse diagram. This picture in the textbooks never happened in nature, he says. Now, why do you have it in the textbooks? I don't think it should be there. It never happened, according to the leading authority in the field. The more we've learned, the more we've had to eliminate even the few links that have been proposed as links. This is similar to the statement that Derek Ager makes, past president of the British Geological Association, writing the proceedings of the Geological Association, says it must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have now been debunked. And he goes on to mention several of them, including the horse in North America. One after the other, they have fallen, and as Rapp acknowledged, we've got fewer now than we had in Darwin's day when he predicted there would be more. Ager continues, said, well, yes, these things that we've had in the textbooks have been debunked, and on top of that, my own experience of more than 20 years looking for evolutionary lineages among the Mesozoic brachiopodia. This is his area of expertise. Now, you don't find many fossil horses in the record. Very few vertebrates, as we pointed out. But brachiopods, the marine invertebrates, you find by the billions. Now, he's one of the leading experts in the world on this fossil that you find by the billions. If you could find evolution, boy, he would be one who could find it. He's been looking for 20 years. He says, my own experience here has proved equally elusive. He hasn't found any kind of evolutionary change there at all, and he's had to eliminate some of those stories. But we're pointed to examples like Archaeopteryx in the textbooks. Here is surely a link. This is half reptile, half bird, restored to look sometimes more like that, but usually very much like a bird, and I think that's what he was, an excellent bird. But why do they say this is the link that led to the birds from the reptiles? Well, we look at the teeth, and they point out he's got bird teeth, and he's got claws on the end of his wings. Some beautiful fossils now of better than half a dozen different specimens that have been found. The wings are perfectly designed for powered flight, many would say. We look at the feathers, they're asymmetrical like flying birds, not symmetrical like the non-flying bird. They're like an airfoil. But on the end of the wings they have claws, and so we're told here this makes him primitive. Except we see modern birds that have claws, like the Hoatzin in South America, the cassowary in the juvenile form, and by the way, all of the fossil forms we found of Archaeopteryx are juvenile forms, have claws just like Archaeopteryx. But the teeth, look at the teeth, that makes him primitive, doesn't it? Well, throughout the animal kingdom we see amphibians that have teeth and some that don't, and we see some mammals that have teeth and some that don't. We see some birds that have teeth and some that don't, and maybe some of you have teeth and some don't, some have pointed out. Does that mean we're more primitive? Actually, what we find is that the genetics for teeth are in many birds. Even chickens can be made to grow teeth with the right stimulation of the genetics. They did have it, and they no longer express it. There's a sense in which they lost what they had, which is a downward process. Lots of genetic information necessary for teeth, but many things like the terns used to have excellent teeth, and they have lost it. Furthermore, what we find in birds in the form of teeth is very different from what we see with reptiles. Notice this statement from one of the leading journals about birds, the auk. Theropod dinosaurs, by comparison, have serrated teeth with straight roots and no constriction. Archaeopteryx has unserrated teeth with constricted bases and expanded roots like those of other Mesozoic birds. They had good bird teeth, not like dinosaur teeth, like birds. But the real clincher comes with a discovery made out in West Texas, reported here in Nature. We're told the fossil remains claim to be of two crow-sized birds 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx have been found. And no, I don't buy those ages, but let's just play the game their way and see how it comes out. If it is the case, then they have serious problems here. Here's a bird, a very modern bird according to nature, that's half again as old, according to their estimates, as Archaeopteryx. Now, Archaeopteryx is supposed to lead to the birds, but the birds got there way before Archaeopteryx, according to this discovery. Looking again, we're told a paleontologist at Texas Tech University, this is Dr. Chatterjee, found the fossil, says they have advanced avian features. Now, many have gotten real upset about this, but he's beautifully documented this in a very elaborately illustrated book, and his case is well made and reported here in Science. You got birds before Archaeopteryx. How could Archaeopteryx lead to the birds? That's a real problem. And others have just reached the conclusion that they're really not that similar. Douglas Fatumia, who is an anti-creationist, written several books against the creationist, admits in the Chronicle of Higher Education, or they're talking about him there, that birds could not come from dinosaurs. They're just dramatically different. And here they report that Yale University released a landmark publication, this in '96. The impetus for the book was the fact that dinosaur and origin of birds had become overnight the dogma in the field, and many of us from the ornithological side, that is the experts on birds, felt that it was simply wrong. He continues saying that birds descended from dinosaurs is utter nonsense. When you look at birds, you see the respiratory system, the circulatory system is just totally, radically different. You see, yes, there are three digits on the foot, but they come again from different parts of the embryo. They're not the same three digits, and that certainly argues then against a common origin for those three digits. W.E. Swenson sums up the evidence for birds from the fossil record in his book Comparative Biology and Comparative Physiology. He's from Cambridge, one of the leading experts in the world. He says, the origin of birds is largely a matter of deduction. There is no fossil evidence. What did he say? No fossil evidence of the stages through which the remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved. Now, we're talking about a revolutionary change. In many cases, hollow bones. We're talking about a structure that allows birds to breathe in and then don't stop and turn around and breathe back out. It just continues to flow on out through their wings. They need a very efficient respiratory system, which they have. And likewise, the rapid blood flow is necessary, and so they have a totally different kind of heart. Now, here is a radically different, revolutionary change that took place. And how much evidence is there of this radical, dramatic change in the fossil record? The leading expert says zip. Now, if you document evolution, then you've got to show this progressive change, and you don't have it. If it happened this way, there ought to be some evidence, but the leading authorities say, nope, not anything, and Archaeopteryx can't. Even Gould acknowledges Archaeopteryx doesn't prove the point. It's just a curious mosaic, he says. And the leading experts say birds are totally different. It doesn't work, and you got birds before Archaeopteryx. D.B. Kitts summarizes what we're talking about with the nature of the fossil record when he says evolution requires intermediate forms. I mean, this is, how else would you see it? That's what it takes to show evolution in the fossil record between species, and paleontology does not provide them. How many times have you heard fossils prove evolution? Well, how would they do it? Showing intermediate forms, change from one to the other. No. The leading authorities in the field here, writing in the journal Evolution, says paleontology does not provide them. He continues saying the fact that discontinuities, now it's continuities that show change and evolutionary progress, the fact that discontinuities are almost always and systematically present at the origin of really big categories is an item of genuinely historical knowledge. Now, writing in the journal Evolution tells you what he believes, but what the actual facts are, he acknowledges to be discontinuities, not just randomly caused by incomplete sampling, but systematically present. When you find something really different, you've got a gap. And we know that. That's genuine historical knowledge. In fact, D.S. Woodruff, University of California at San Diego, writing in Science, he's a textbook author, well-known authority in the field, just fesses up. He says, fossil species remain unchanged. This is what Gould says. We know we don't see this change throughout most of their history, and the record fails to contain a single example. He's given up, evidently, on Archaeopteryx or on these links that are supposed to have led. Fails to contain a single example of a significant transition. Now, this is not a lightweight. This is one of the leading authorities, and likewise with S.M. Stanley, the paleontology department of Johns Hopkins, one of the leading authorities in the field, says, in fact, the fossil record does not convincingly document a single transition from one species to the other. Now, if evolution is proved by the fossil record, how would it be done? Well, showing a transition from one to the other. The leading authorities say they don't change, and it fails to document one transition. Wow. Again, if we were trying to write the stories of creationists, we couldn't have really done, in fact, I wouldn't have been that bold. Now, they firmly believe this. These men, in spite of what it may sound like, believe devoutly, unquestionably, in evolution. The idea is expressed by A.C. Stewart this way. He says, the theoretically primitive type eludes our grasp. Our faith postulates its existence, but the type fails to materialize. Now, they believe they're men of great faith. But as someone has said, for the evolutionists, their faith is the substance of fossils hoped for and the evidence of links unseen. You don't see what you need to see in order to see evolution in the fossil record, but they believe it by faith. And it's a faith that's a blind faith in spite of the evidence, not because of it. And sometimes they even say that. Notice the statement by Niles Eldredge, the American Museum of Natural History. They're professor of geology, curator there of invertebrate paleontology. Gould's cohort, written articles together with him, says it has been the paleontologist, my own breed, who have been most responsible for letting ideas dominate reality. Now, that's not the way it's supposed to work in science. The reality is what produces the ideas. No, here's the idea. We've let that dominate the facts, the reality. He says, we paleontologists have said that the history of life supports that interpretation. He's talking about the gradual change that's in all the textbooks. We've said that, all the while knowing that it does not. And so we're looking not at just a blind faith, but there's a sense in which you could describe it as a dishonest faith, knowing that the evidence points in the other direction. They knew better, but they said it because that's, of course, their faith, and they're committed to naturalism. One of the reasons why some of these men are willing to make such amazing acknowledgments of what is true is that they do think they have an answer to that, and there is a response that's made to the kind of evidence that we've documented from the leading evolutionists. We're told the answer is punctuated equilibria. Oh, that sounds really impressive. And Stephen Gould, together with Niles Eldredge, has promoted this idea. And we'll allow Eldredge and Gould to comment on this in paleobiology. They say, in fact, most published commentary on punctuated equilibria has been favorable. We are especially pleased that several paleontologists now state with pride and biological confidence a conclusion that had previously been simply embarrassing. All right, now they can be proud they were embarrassed. What was it that embarrassed them? All these years of work, and I haven't found any evolution. They don't have to be embarrassed about not finding any evolution anymore. They can now be proud because they've got the answer, punctuated equilibria. It's very similar to a concept that was espoused a number of years earlier, similar even according to Gould, as Goldberg had proposed what he called the hopeful monster mechanism. And he just said, well, you look at the fossil record, you don't see this gradual change, and so Mama reptile must have laid an egg and a bird hatched out. I'm sure that surprised Papa reptile. We know something about genetics that tells us this sort of thing doesn't happen. Most geneticists seem to think that it was Goldsmith that laid the egg. But he didn't have the fancy name, you know, hopeful monster. That didn't sound nearly scientific. Now then, Gould says he thinks that Goldsmith would be vindicated, and he says it's punctuated equilibria, which is similar. Well, let's let Stanley describe how this works. Writing in his book, he says, the record now reveals that species typically survive for 100,000 generations, even 1 million or more, without evolving very much. This is that principle of stasis that dominates the record. They don't change, as Gould acknowledged. You don't see that. All right? That's what we see in the fossil record. We've documented that. What does that mean? Well, he tells you what that means. We seem forced to conclude that most evolution takes place rapidly. Oh, I can see how that follows. You see, if you begin with the absolute unquestioned faith that it happened, and you don't see it happening gradually, then it must have happened rapidly. It went so fast you didn't see it. And that's exactly what they're telling us. Continuing with Stanley's statement, he says a punctuational model of evolution, that's what he's describing here, is operated by a natural mechanism. He wants you to know it's natural. It may look supernatural, but no, it's a natural, and he won't tell you what the mechanism is because they really don't have a good mechanism for changing so fast. Well, they just sort of sped up the old one, but anyway, he says it's a natural mechanism whose major effects are wrought exactly where we're least able to study them. Small, localized, transitory populations. You can't see it. See, it went so fast you can't see it. It happened out here where nobody can watch it happen. The point here is that if the transition was typically rapid, the population small and localized, fossil evidence of the event would never be found. Well, isn't that nice? What is science supposed to be but the evidence in the rocks that we follow? Oh no, the evidence is lying to us again. It must be there even though we don't see it. But now we've come up with a story about why we don't see it, and that's science, and that's the answer, and now we can be proud because we've solved the problem. We've just basically come up with a story. Now, notice where this leaves them. They don't really have fossils to support this evolutionary, and they not only say they don't have it, but they can't find it and won't find it. Just don't even look anymore. And Gould has acknowledged, as well as many of the other leading authorities, that these small changes don't add up to the big ones, as we saw earlier in the series. He doesn't have a mechanism, certainly not the mechanism in the textbooks. He says mutation doesn't produce major new raw material. You don't make a new species by mutating the species. It's a common idea people have, that evolution is due to random mutation. The mutation is not the cause of these processes. These mechanisms taught in the textbook are not what does it. You don't have fossils, you don't have mechanisms. Now, let's compare the two modes of explanation here. On the one hand, you have punctuated equilibrium with evolutionary explanations that depend on unobserved mechanisms and unobserved fossils and assurances you'll never find them, compared with mechanisms that we see every day, kind reproducing after kind. You ever seen that? That's what you see. And billions of fossils that show a sudden and complex beginning and distinct separate kinds, and as we have seen, millions, billions of generations without change. The principle of state. We observe fossils, we observe mechanisms, and we follow the implications. On the other hand, you've got unobserved mechanisms and unobserved fossils. Now, is it really difficult to determine which is better science? I think it's obvious which is better science. We're not talking about implications of Sunday school lessons. We're talking about the positive evidence of the fossils that support the creation model. Billions of fossils that show very distinctly evidence that would support the creation model more. Now, some have responded in various ways. Notice the response of Colin Patterson. Again, senior paleontologist for the biggest fossil museum in the world, British Museum of Natural History. Well, it seemed to me They've accepted the fossil record doesn't give them the support they would value, so they searched around to find another one and found one. When you haven't got the evidence, you make up a story that will fit the lack of evidence. Now that's not science, it's a scenario, it's a story, which Colin Patterson just frankly acknowledges. Still others take a different tack. Interestingly, we see Mark Ridley of Oxford saying, no, we don't even use the fossils anymore. He says a lot of people just do not know what evidence the theory of evolution stands on. Okay, we don't know. What is it we think? They think that the main evidence is the gradual descent of one species from another in the fossil record. Well, yes, that's supposed to be the evidence. As Stanley says, the only documentary evidence, the only real proof would have to be here. He says, without this, it's just an outrageous hypothesis, you recall? Many people think that. Well, yes, but he says, no, that's not the case. In any case, he says, no real evolutionist, whether gradualist or punctuationalist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. No, well, that's of course not true, but this is the way he approaches it now. You don't use the fossil record. Well, why not? Believe me, he would if he could. If it said what he wanted it to say, he would be preaching it. But the more we've learned about it, the more we've seen it doesn't, and so he just walks away. It kind of reminds me of Aesop's fable where the fox was just jumping and working hard, long and hard to get those grapes, and finally couldn't and gave up and said, I didn't want those grapes, they were sour. Now, Hoover got some sour fossils. He tried and tried for over 100 years and tried to fill in those gaps and show the change in the fossil. Well, no, we don't even use fossils anymore. Just we don't want those. Is that obvious or what? I use the fossils. The fossils belong to the creationists because that's what they're telling us. That's the dramatic picture that we see in the positive evidence portrayed by the fossil record. E.J.H. Corner of Cambridge is talking about his field in botany, but it's the same picture that we see throughout the fossil record. Much evidence can be adduced, he says, in favor of the theory of evolution from biology and geography and paleontology, but I still think, to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of special creation. And why does he say that? Sudden complex beginning. You don't see the change documented in the fossil record. Separate, distinct kinds. It says special creation, and he acknowledges that, and that's what we see when we look at the fossil record. Let's summarize it this way. In the critical beginning, we see sudden, complex, diverse fossils. We see all of the major phyla, and they're none new since. We see these trees of life representing change, but they're not from the fossil record. They're not from embryology, from common genetics. They're better explained, I would say, by a common designer, because when we look at the similarities, it reveals not the branching pattern, but similarities that are just all over the place randomly in cockroaches and in butterbeans and in chickens, a mosaic pattern of similarity that you can line up either from pig to bull to man or from ape to man, depending on who arbitrarily selects the similarities and ignores others. The evidence, the fossil record, delights the creationist according to the evolutionist and embarrasses the evolutionist according to the evolutionist. The evidence was Darwin's biggest problem then, and it's worse now because there are fewer examples. The links, according to the leading evolutionists, have one by one been debunked so that some say there's not any left. Their blind faith postulates the existence, they say evolution, but the actual fossils themselves, according to the implications which they acknowledge, speak. And they speak loudly and clearly and eloquently, billions of them positively in favor of the theory of creation. I think the creation model is obviously supported much better by the fossil record for the reasons we've discussed. It's not a matter of blind faith, it's just following the truth, the evidence, wherever we find it.